Now, Declan, I do find some of your more recent miscellaneous poems, they're really, really moving, especially the poem Chorus, which I actually understand is written or was written for Amnesty International. Was this essentially a protest poem?
Yes, Lisa, you could say that. Some years ago, Amnesty asked Irish writers if they would contribute to a periodical, not a periodical, but a book called Human Rights Have No Borders, Voices of Irish Poets. So I wrote this poem, which is about a prisoner of conscience who has been tortured for his beliefs. He's now being taken out at dawn to be executed. And as he's being taken out, there's one solitary bird singing. But later on, as the execution proceeds, more and more birds are joining in the dawn chorus, which is always a very beautiful sound. And in a sense, it's an extended metaphor for the fact that one voice alone can't change things, can't change politics, but that if you have enough voices together, that change can be affected. And this, in a sense, is a metaphor for what Amnesty International does. So I was very privileged to have been asked to do this poem because the proceeds went to Amnesty. So I'll read the poem for you. Chorus. In the grey distance, a bird sings above the seeping walls, its frail notes hesitant as the mind, taut, awaiting shock imminence of flame or cattle prod. The nails extracted in the nightmare of 1,000 cells scratch their red calligraphy from station to station, as the bird's voice crescendos in chorus, sharper than the ring of steel, and the clear carillon of bells defies the dawn volley, its growing insistence louder than injustice.
Another very poignant poem is the poem Underground, which is about the 7/7 bombings back in 2005. I was wondering if you could explain what inspired you to write about such, well, to put it mildly, an appalling atrocity.
It was about the 7/7 bombings. There's a friend and colleague of mine called Pat Cassidy, whom I've worked with for many years, and he suffered a terrible loss of his young nephew, Kieran, and he had been killed in the bombings while on the way to work. Now, this is a young man who was minding his own business, who had aspirations to become a footballer, who had dreams of going to Australia, as most young men might have had at the time, and he became one of the innocent victims of this bomb. I was very moved by what had happened and how the family suffered as a result. So I wrote this little poem as a tribute to this young man. It's difficult when you write a poem like that to get a balance between outrage and sensitivity, but I was happy enough that my colleague Pat liked the poem and the family seemed to be happy with it. So I'll read the poem called Underground. Underground, a tribute to Kieran Cassidy, who died in the London bombings July the 7th, 2005. Was the thought of playing for Arsenal still a recurring dream that morning on the tube? Or did the southern pastures of Australia offer better prospects? Long, long dreams in a young man's mind can dull the tedium of the commonplace, the sway of the carriage, the heaving crowd, the final destination, seconds away. Entombed in the underground, your orison was the groundswell of support from Finsbury through Enniskillen to Swanland Bar, your obsequies the tears of Islington Celtic, your requiem the swish of steel on steel, the exits and the entrances from King's Cross to Russell Square, the crush of crowds, or, back in Cavan, your name soft-spoken.
You mentioned earlier that your very first poem had been inspired by Francis Ledwidge, the poem Lament for Poets. You've written a more recent poem as a tribute to Ledwidge, and you mentioned the novelist, the poet and the playwright, Dermot Bolger in it, of course. If you wouldn't mind, would you mind reading it to us and then explaining just the content?
As I explained earlier, my first poem had been a plagiarised version of Ledwidge's Lament for the Poets. But I also learnt later on that the poet, playwright and novelist Dermot Bolger had also had a Ledwidge connection, in that as a teenager he had bought the famous biography of Ledwidge by Alice Curtain with his last few pence. And as a result he had to walk all the way home to Finglas, but he was obviously happy to have the book under his arm. Now, as he walked home to Finglas, he walked the very same route that the young teenage Ledwidge had walked when he had got fed up with his job as an apprentice grocer in Rathfarnham village and had taken off in the early hours of the morning to walk all the way to Slane. So in a sense, Dermot Bolger and I had a drink together over the last few years down in Park na Silla in a hotel down there, and we discussed our connection and the Ledwidge connection in particular. And we talked about the fact that Ledwidge, he was dead by the time he was about 30 because of the First World War, so his whole career was cut short. And we felt that in our middle years that we had realised what Ledwidge had not realised, both both socially and literary sense. So I'll read the poem. Road Building, a tribute to Francis Ledwidge, for Dermot Bulger. You walk before us still in the hush of eve, a young man in khaki, mud spattered from road building, retracing your steps to Slane. You sang for me when I delivered my infant poem, and in the chords and internal rhyme, I proudly glossed 400 years of bardic gold, honed since the first blackbird gilded branches to lament my stolen pigeons. On another journey, a young man walked in your footsteps, retracing each milestone to uncertain future beyond Finglas. We have realised your stolen years, have seen the dark cow leave the moor, but still you beckon us on to build and build, with pick and shovel, roads not travelled, things that never were, ways uncharted in cyberspace, whose goal is still delight. In the comfort of a southern hotel, we share your youthful dreams, brought at last to fruition in our middle years. You place your hands on our shoulders, look calm as the day you built your last road, walk from us slowly to the homely moor.
So to return to the late Nuala Foilán, now you have a beautiful tribute to her entitled Resolution, which you tell me appeared in the Sunday Tribune shortly after her heartrending interview with Marion Finucane. Now, I was hoping perhaps you'd introduce the poem and then read it aloud and just tell us a little bit about it.
I was very privileged to have been lectured by Nuala back in the late 60s, early 70s in UCD. And at that time she taught a course called the Victorian Sage. And the keynote of that particular course was Pater's dictum, to burn always with that gem-like flame. So she had helped me at a later stage when I was writing my poems. She had advised me on what worked and what didn't work. She had encouraged me to write the poem about my grandfather and so forth. So I was very, very moved, as were most people who heard that interview with Marion Finucane. So I wrote this particular poem trying to express maybe what many, many people were thinking at that particular time, because she had said that passion had gone out of her life. And I sort of made the point that her life was never a waste of time, that she had had a huge contribution to make. So the poem mirrors sort of her interview as well as my connection with her. Resolution, for Nuala Foilán, as a token of my esteem and gratitude. Above the Galway lane, the Milky Way is luminous with possibility. Splashed on black, it offers definition. I see you lecturing in the terrace, a mini-skirted Victorian sage, burning always with a hard gem-like flame, where passion was the order of the day, and reflection a poor second, feebly quivering like the blue smoke of joss sticks. You moulded my verse, erased my clichés, eased hesitant lines onto my pages with skillful pointers, with candid humour. Now, your hesitant words touch the nation. Staring into the void, your reflection consigns old passion to the wings. Yet your calm dignity uplifts, and I offer you straws to clutch at against the terror of the surging night, insisting that no spark of your rich life can ever be extinguished, that we are the warmer for that gem-like flame of your interlude.